Yes, you should be able to
Yes,
share.
yes,
Yep.
I can. And let's go right over here. And then I need to go slideshow from the beginning. All right. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about popular culture and how we might use it in both planetarium shows and in education in general. As many of you know, I'm a great fan and collector of astronomy and other media and other ways of thinking. So I hope that you will get some new ideas from this. And if you have suggestions that I didn't cover, please put them in the chat window. That would be great. I'm particularly going to focus on music, but I'm going to just begin by showing you that astronomy really is all around us, whether it's in the things we eat, especially just before going on for a planetarium show, or the things we have for breakfast. I love this one, Meteor Bites, a granola with a boost, and it's from Galaxy Granola, if you'll notice the company. And then this has been recently that dark matter has come into the marketplace. There's dark matter coffee, but even better, on the right, you see dark matter growth accelerator, which is some kind of a drugstore thing. But since dark matter is known to accelerate the growth of structure in galaxies, I thought that was very appropriate to have dark matter growth accelerator for sale. One of my favorites, the original Einstein's energy bar. It's relatively delicious. I'm not sure this is still being sold, but I got a picture of it when it was in its heyday. Of course, we all know cars that have astronomical names, some still with us and some long gone, like the Chevy Nova, which blew up, I might say, as a sales thing. And many of you know that Subaru means the Pleiades in Japanese, and you can see their symbol having a star cluster on it. There's lots of drinks. Actually, I know an astronomy educator who collects astronomical beers, and he's got a huge collection of bottles. Here are two of my favorites, the Galileo Astronomical Ale, and then Quasar Pale Ale from the Ecliptic Brewing Company. How have you lived without this drink? And I love this recent picture that was posted on the web, reminding us that the comet Neowise is not the only comet that's in our lives. And actually, whenever I do any kind of a family activity or group, I often start with this as a warm-up activity to get particularly the kids in the group to think of as many astronomical products as they can. That gets them warmed up to be part of whatever else is going on. Of course, astronomy is on stamps, and there is actually an entire hobby of collecting astronomical stamps. You may know that the stamp collecting world has a topical association where people join different topical groups, and there's the astronomy study unit of the American Topical Association if you want to get seriously into the collecting of astronomical stamps. Many countries have issued a wide variety, some quite beautiful series of stamps celebrating observatories, objects in the sky, astronomers, etc. One of my favorites that a student brought me is the black hole pinball machine, now probably replaced by video games, which I don't keep up with. But I love the error at the very beginning of this advertisement that you are to discover the magnetic attraction of black hole. Clearly, they needed to go to a planetarium and learn about the gravitational attraction of black holes instead. But let me now switch from this more fun kind of thing to a slightly more serious arena, and that's the arena of music. I've actually compiled a catalog of over 200 different pieces of music inspired by serious astronomy, not just someone saying, oh, it's June, there's the moon, let's spoon. There's lots of songs, particularly popular songs, which mention an astronomical object, but I wanted only musical pieces where the composer thought a little bit about astronomical phenomena and actually made the song or the piece about that. So let's take a look at a variety of music like this. I'd like to quote Albert Einstein, who wrote that life without playing music is inconceivable for me. I get most joy in life out of music. And I don't need to tell planetarium people who use music so effectively in their work that this is, of course, absolutely true. So there's a wide range of music. Perhaps the astronomer who was most connected with music was Kepler, who actually thought that the planets played a kind of harmony of the spheres. Here you see a little bit of the notes that he associated with each planet. And many composers have taken that idea of the harmony of the spheres, the harmony of the solar system, and made interesting music out of it. For example, Paul Hindemith, a 20th century composer, wrote an entire opera called The Harmony of the World, in which you hear a little bit of Kepler's life and Kepler's ideas. That is available both as an opera and as a symphonic extract, and kind of interesting music. Philip Glass, a rather well-known minimalist composer of our day, has been writing a series of operas about astronomers. Perhaps the best, well, second best known one is the one he wrote about Kepler, which combines discussions of Kepler's life and times with some of his astronomical ideas. And again, I've only listed those musical pieces here and in my catalog that are actually available either as CDs or if you go to YouTube as pieces you can see on the web. And so Kepler, the opera Kepler has been produced by a number of different companies around the world. Glass, as I say, has been doing a series like this. The first one, and the one that's perhaps best known, was Einstein on the Beach, which was interesting in the sense that it was more a meditation on Einstein rather than a straightforward story of Einstein's work. But as a meditation, many things about Einstein come up as mantras and as symbols in the opera, which you can meditate on as you hear the rather repetitive but interesting music that Philip Glass is associated with. More recently, he had another opera about Galileo, which was premiered on disc by the Portland Opera. So these are things that you can explore. Not all of this music is the kind that you'd necessarily want to play for a long time, but they're interesting attempts to combine music and astronomy. On a more popular level, Todd Rundgren has a wonderful piece about Stephen Hawking. It's just called Hawking, and it's on his album Nearly Human. And it's really a very beautiful thought about how difficult it must have been to be in Hawking's body with Hawking's mind. And students have appreciated when I've played this song when we were talking about Hawking's work in my classes. So it's on the Todd Rundgren album, Nearly Human, and the song is just called Hawking. And then there's the story of Leo Smit. Leo Smit was a composer and also was interested in science quite a bit, and got to be friends with the astronomer Fred Hoyle. Here on you see the two of them, Smit over here and Hoyle over here. They had many discussions about the relative value of science and music. In particular, they would go hiking. They both loved hiking. And they would debate that if somehow it was the future and people were looking back from hundreds and hundreds of years into the future to the 20th century, what would play a more important role in that future world, 20th century music or 20th century science? Around the time of the anniversary of Copernicus's birth in the 1970s, they then wrote a piece together called Copernicus. And part of that piece was actually a credo. A credo is kind of a statement of belief. And Fred Hoyle wrote a very beautiful astronomer's statement of belief, which is part of this piece, Copernicus, which you can find both on the web and on CRI records. Out of their discussions, out of having written this piece together, came a novel that Fred Hoyle wrote called October the 1st is Too Late. I'm a big science fiction fan. I think many of you may also be interested in science fiction, but this is a particularly not well-known novel, but I think an intriguing one. It's the first instance that I found in science fiction literature taking seriously the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. That view of quantum mechanics in which whenever there's a choice, the universe splits into two parts and both things happen. So Schrodinger's cat is both alive and dead in different universes. And not only does Fred Hoyle work out the consequences of that theory in October the 1st is Too Late, but the heroes actually wind up in the future where there's a big debate about who's more relevant and significant, the composer or the scientist. So October the 1st is Too Late. Speaking of plays that take off from the lives of scientists, this is not a musical example, but I just wanted to mention that there is a wonderful playwright called Lauren Gunderson. If you're not familiar with her work, I strongly recommend looking into some of the things she's done. For example, she has a variety of plays, some humorous, some not, one about Newton, and one about how some of George Gamow's co-workers must have felt on the day when Penzias and Wilson got the Nobel Prize for the 3-degree background radiation, and they weren't even recognized. But her most perhaps well-known and most often performed play, not a musical play, but a straight drama, is Silent Sky, which is all about the work of Henrietta Leavitt at the Harvard College Observatory when the women there were called computers. And Henrietta Leavitt was hearing impaired and going deaf while she was doing the important work on Cepheid variables. And this is a very moving and also funny play about some of the challenges she faced as she was doing her work on Cepheid. It's called Silent Sky by Lauren Gunderson. Also, there's an Australian play called Bright Star, which is all about the very short life of cosmologist Beatrice Tinsley and some of the work she did in galaxies and cosmology. This is something that's more difficult to find, but also an astronomically based play. And I have a whole bibliography of astronomically based plays if you're interested. But returning to music, let's go back. And there's so many things about the moon and the planets. I only have time to show you just a little bit. But I wanted to mention, in particular, I think my favorite piece of music about the moon, which is Walking on the Moon by the Police. And let me play you a little bit of this, if this works. Yeah. 1, 2, All right, so you probably heard a little of that he's comparing the feeling of being in love to the feeling of walking on the moon. And I think that's a very apt analogy. So I like to play this in my classes. Hold on one sec. All right, so let's go on. Of course, many of us like to play The Planets by Gustav Holst. It's even NASA has played it. So I'm very sorry if I'm the first one to tell you that actually Gustav Holst based this entire piece on the astrological characteristics of the planets, and it has nothing to do with astronomy. Holst was a 20th century composer, and he had another friend, another composer as a friend, Arnold Bax, and Bax's brother was really into astrology and introduced Holst to astrology, and he got so into it he began casting horoscopes for friends and colleagues and getting his wife involved. So this presents a tremendous moral dilemma for those of us who are astronomy people, because I'm, as I think many of you are, a great battler against astrology. I give talks about why astrology is utter nonsense. And so playing a piece that was actually affected by astrology is a difficult choice. Now, many people have gone beyond the planets themselves and made new pieces based on things that were not in the original and things that have nothing to do with astrology. So for example, if you get the Sir Simon Rattle version of the planets on EMI, they add a piece called Pluto the Renewer, and then asteroid 4179 to Taurus and Osiris and Ceres. And so there are now other pieces like this that you can use. There is a New Zealand Symphony Orchestra version with a companion piece called The Glittering Hosts of Heaven, which is all about the Maori conceptions of the Pleiades. And so there are other pieces of music that take off from where we all thought the planets was coming from, which is from the characteristics of the planets. All right, so then there's the whole question of the constellations. I think many of us are particularly interested in constellation music. Let me go to the next slide. Perhaps the best known has to do with the 2004 Olympics, where Philip Glass, who I mentioned earlier, was commissioned to do a major piece about the legends of different countries associated with the constellation of Orion. And this is available as a very interesting album where the different pieces are played by instruments, characteristics of the countries where the composer is from. And there's some fascinating pieces all relating to Orion on the album. Another piece of music which is really weird is by the bad boy of electronic music, John Cage, who wrote a piece of music called Atlas Eclipticalis. And in this piece of music, he took an old star atlas, put some tracing paper over it with musical notation bars, lines, and then put the notes wherever the stars were in important constellations. So the notes make no musical sense, but they're arranged in the way on the musical staff that the stars are arranged in the sky. This is a far better idea to think about than music to listen to. But nevertheless, some people enjoy this kind of electronic music of the constellations. So Atlas Eclipticalis, and there are other pieces of music by Cage and by other electronic composers having to do with the constellations, with maps of the sky. And in my catalog that I'll give you a link to in a little while, you can find all of these organized by topic. One that you may not have heard of is an American composer named Bruce Lazarus, who is both a composer and a pianist. And on this album, Messier Catalog of Star Clusters and Nebulae, he's put together little pieces about each, not each, but a good number of the well-known Messier objects. So this is more pleasant music, and one that I think especially appeals to sky observers. Bruce Lazarus is the composer. Again, many of these are, of course, not so easy to find anymore, but you can find things on the web often, even if you can't find them in what old folks like me call record stores, which is basically Amazon these days. I want to then move on to music about the lives of the stars briefly. This is one of my favorite old cartoons about stellar evolution from the BC series, where he goes up to top of a hill and says, starlight, star bright, and it keeps getting brighter and brighter, and finally winds up saying, first supernova I see tonight. And again, there are many, many different pieces of music about starlights, but perhaps the most familiar, and the one that your students may have heard of, is by a self-styled nerd musical group called They Might Be Giants, and it's called Why Does the Sun Shine? The sun is a mass of incandescent gas. And so this became a little bit popular. It's all about, it's made from an old film. It was inspired by an old, I think even black and white film about the sun that was popular in the 50s. And this song became popular, and then someone wrote to them and said, well, wait a minute, the sun really isn't gas, it's plasma. And they got all worried about this, that they had somehow perpetuated an incorrect scientific idea, and here they were, the premier nerd group of the world. So there's now a second version, which is, why does the sun shine? The sun is a miasma of plasma. So you can get either version. And they have a whole series of songs all about scientific topics. If you Google them, you can get to some albums and other songs which are pretty nerdy and are relevant to some of the introductory programs that we do. The name of the group is They Might Be Giants. But I can't resist showing this, even though the music has nothing to do with astronomy. This is an album by Van de Graaff Generator. You've all heard of Van de Graaff Generator, I presume. No, they were a pretty unsuccessful group, but they had an album entitled H2HE, Who Am the Only One. Now, what do you think the average rock and roll fan made of the title of this album? Oh, they must have been under the influence of some drugs when they came up. What does that title even mean? But you and I know what this title means. This is all about hydrogen to helium, which is the key way of making energy in the universe. And just in case you didn't get it, if you look at the bottom of the album, it's hard to see on my fuzzy picture. At the bottom of the album, you see the PP chain written out, all three steps of the proton-proton chain, that is the main producer of energy in the sun, written out correctly at the bottom of this album cover. So this is a real collector's item in my astronomy music collection. But none of the songs in this album have anything to do with astronomy, unfortunately. And then when you talk about astronomical evolution of stars, you need to eventually get to black holes. I'm going to show you a couple of songs about black holes, but I want to challenge you in a minute. Let's see. Probably the best known song about black holes is on the album of the Canadian heavy metal group Rush. The album is called A Farewell to Kings, and the song is called Cygnus X1. And Cygnus X1 is so well known a song that there's a Marvel comic book based on it, which I show you here on the right. The Marvel comic book goes through the song with some pretty far out illustrations. If you don't know this song, here are some of the words. It's a long song. In the constellation of Cygnus, there lurks a mysterious invisible force. All who dare to cross her course are swallowed by a fearsome force. It goes on like this. Somebody in the group must have known some astronomy. At the end, it says, the X-ray is her siren song. My ship cannot resist her long, nearer to my deadly goal until the black hole gains control. So it's an interesting song, Cygnus X1 by Rush. There's also a Mandolier, who is an unusual singer in England, and she had a black hole song that was popular for a while. There are, at least the way I've been able to get it, 5 specific black hole songs in rock and roll history, all of which have correct black hole imagery in it. So I've shown you 2 of them, the Rush song and the Mandolier, and I want to challenge you to tell me other astronomically correct black hole songs. If you know one that I haven't mentioned, please put it in the chat window and we'll look at that at the end of the discussion. See which of you can come up with additional reasonable astronomy black hole song. All right, then there's music about galaxies. I love this Sidney Harris cartoon. If you don't know Sidney Harris, the cartoonist, he's a science cartoonist who has just one after another great cartoons about both astronomy and physics. Sidney Harris is his name. And the story that many people may not know is the story about CTA-102. CTA-102 was a quasar, and originally back in the 60s, after quasars were discovered, there were reports that Russian radio astronomers had been tuning in, if you will, to CTA-102 and had found rhythmic radio signals that were indicative of intelligent life. And for a while, this was a big story covered by newspapers and magazines. Eventually, it turned out that there was nothing to the story. There was no coded signals in CTA-102, just a normal radio emission that we get from quasars. But it became such a story that the singing group, the Byrds, then came up in their album called Younger Than Yesterday with a song called CTA-102, which got to be, a little bit popular as an album song by this quite popular group, the Byrds. And Dr. Eugene Epstein, who was at the Aerospace Corporation doing radio astronomy, in fact of CTA-102, then submitted a paper to the Astrophysical Journal all about the radio emissions of this quasar. And he had a real mischievous sense of humor. So when he got the page proofs back, not in the original manuscript, but after he got the page proofs back, he put an additional reference in at the end of the paper in which the authors were the members of the group Byrds, and it said private communication. And the editor of the Astrophysical Journal didn't catch it, and so it went into the Astrophysical Journal. This is the only time that a rock and roll group had a reference in an Astrophysical Journal article. He then sent that to the studio that handled the Byrds, and it got to the Byrds, and he got to be friends with some of the members of the singing group. And he enjoyed telling this story for many, many years, how we got a rock and roll group into the Astrophysical Journal. All right, and then certainly when you talk about galaxies, one important person you need to know about is Fiorella Terenzi. She's sometimes referred to as a cross between Carl Sagan and Madonna. And this is her book, Heavenly Knowledge. This is, by the way, she herself refers to herself that way, so I'm not trying to be sexist. And she did an album called Music from the Galaxies, in which she based the notes on some of the radio emission characteristics of the galaxies. And she's still teaching astronomy and physics, I believe, somewhere in Florida. And for a while, she was kind of she made the rounds of talk shows and so on, talking about both her music and astronomy. And this leads us to a whole kind of area of astronomical music where the notes are based on some scientific idea. It's based on the values of the notes, or something about the music is based on scientific observation. Here, this is based on radio astronomy ideas. Then there's the Hubble Cantata, which is quite a complex piece that requires operatic level singers and an orchestra and a chorus. And it's inspired by the work of the Hubble Space Telescope and has words and ideas from Mario Livio, one of the astronomers at the Space Telescope Science Institute, who has written eloquently about the work of the Hubble. And some of his writings are incorporated into the Hubble Cantata, which I know you can see on the web, and has some rather dramatic music in it. One of the earlier pieces that did this was a piece by Charles Dodge, also an electronic composer, called The Earth's Magnetic Field. And you probably know that geophysicists keep track of the activity of the sun by looking at its effects on the magnetosphere around the Earth. And there are various indexes of geomagnetic activity which are caused by activity on the sun. And he took one of those indexes and made them into music. The variations in the notes are governed by the variations of this geomagnetic index. It's a rather weird sounding piece, but it is available. It's Charles Dodge's Earth's Magnetic Field. And then my recent favorite is called the Supernova Sonata. And it was programmed by two astronomers, Alex Parker and Melissa Graham. And each of the notes in this rather pleasant sounding piano piece are governed by characteristics of type 1a supernovae. You probably know that we are very interested in type 1a supernovae because they're standard bulbs or standard candles, and they allow us to measure distances in the universe. And so 240 type 1a supernovae characteristics went into making the music, both the notes themselves, the instrument that plays them, and the duration of the note being played are governed by characteristics of type 1a supernovae. And you can, again, find this supernova sonata on the web. All right, and then I can't resist mentioning, since we're talking about type 1a supernovae, I want to mention a little bit about cosmology. There are a number of cosmological pieces, but probably the best known one is called Wylam by the electronic composer Stockhausen. Wylam was a term that George Gamow introduced into the scientific literature. It was the ancient Greek term for the original substance out of which the gods made the universe. And so when Gamow was describing the Big Bang theory, which he, of course, had a lot to do with, he, in popular discussions, used the term Wylam as this original substance from which the universe arose. Stockhausen read books by George Gamow and was inspired by them and wrote this amazingly bizarre piece called Wylam, in which the orchestra is in motion. So the musical players are all together in a compact group at the center of the stage. They play a big bang. They get up out of their seats and they move through the auditorium, and they go a certain distance and then they come back, because this is a big bang, big crunch universe that he's playing. And the notes they play are not as important as what they're doing, which is expanding with the universe, moving away from the stage. So some of the notes are programmed to be by telepathic communication. Don't ask. That means that each time they play the piece, it's a little different, because you don't know what notes they're going to telepathically receive and play at that moment. Again, much more interesting to describe and watch than to listen to, but it is perhaps the most dramatic cosmological piece I've come across. Now, as I say, there are many, many more pieces like this. I found 240 of them, and I've organized them into a catalog where each is briefly described. So if you're interested, you can go to bit.ly or bit.ly/astronomy music and find the entire catalog there. I'm sure you can think of other pieces like this. I have not done justice to all the popular music pieces.
I can't do my shoes on them.
I'm sorry?
Just chill.
I can't hear. What did someone said something? Huh? Okay. So again, it's at bit.ly astronomy music if you want to see the entire catalog. bit.ly/astronomy music. All right, I want to move on now to science fiction for a little bit of time. I've been very interested in science fiction as something that is an inspiration for astronomers as well as a way that many of our students and audiences come to astronomy. They may have seen a science fiction movie or a TV series, or if we're lucky, they've actually read a book about astronomy. And so I also have a whole catalog of science fiction that's influenced by serious astronomy, not just random ideas about the stars, but by science fiction writers who have clearly read some serious science and tried to extrapolate from known science to where things are in the future. And of course, no one's better at this, no one's more equipped to do this than astronomers who write science fiction. So I started to collect science fiction by astronomers. I think the first person whom we can call a science fiction writer was an astronomer, was Kepler. He wrote, it's more of a fantasy piece called Somnium, all about lunar astronomy. The story is told that in it, there's the main character's mother is a witch who has the power to get people to the moon. And because of this book, Kepler's mother was sometimes persecuted as a witch, but I'm not a historian. But anyway, the name of the book is Kepler's Somnium, and it is the first fantasy or science fiction that I know of by an astronomer. People have tried their hand at writing science fiction ever since the field arose. One of the first was Simon Newcomb, the great American astronomer who was quite influential around the turn of the century, the 19th to the 20th century. And he wrote a novel called His Wisdom, the Defender, which I think is now out of copyright and you can get through Google Books. In it, scientists invent something that allows them to take over the world. This is a big fantasy for astronomers that we get to somehow take over the world. And Fred Hoyle, whom I mentioned earlier, who wrote science fiction, often wrote science fiction stories in which he tried to expand ideas which the Astrophysical Journal wouldn't let him publish. And the story is told that early on, when he and others were beginning to think about the possibility of organic molecules in interstellar clouds, Hoyle wrote a science paper on this subject, that there could be not just simple molecules, but more complex molecules that form in clouds, particularly thick with dust. And this paper was rejected from several science journals. And Hoyle got really angry and said, well, if I can't publish this as science, I'll publish it as science fiction. And wrote what is perhaps his best known novel called The Black Cloud, in which a dense cloud of interstellar material has so many organic molecules in it and such a sheltering environment for them that the cloud actually becomes not just alive, but intelligent. And this intelligent cloud travels through the galaxy. It happens in the story to come between the sun and the earth, which is not good for the earth in terms of its energy budget. And so astronomers tried to communicate with the cloud to tell it to please go away and not block the sun. And eventually, again, astronomers kind of get to take over the world in the process of conveying the thoughts of this black cloud in the novel. So if you have those kind of fantasies on a bad day in the planetarium, I recommend The Black Cloud by Fred Hoyle. Perhaps the dean of hard science fiction writers, and the term hard science fiction, if you're not familiar with it, is what I described a minute ago, science fiction that's based on extrapolating really good and accurate science. The dean of doing that is Gregory Benford, now retired, but a plasma physicist at the University of California at Irvine, who has written some remarkable books and stories on scientific subjects. This is a beautiful collection of his short stories that I recommend called Worlds Vast and Various. Benford also has a whole series of books all about what it's like at the galactic center and what life would be like at the galactic center on worlds near the galactic center, and in particular about how evolution will eventually replace flesh and blood life with machine life, with mechanical life, and how that mechanical life will ultimately come to regard biological life as a kind of organic scum that they need to clean up to get order in the universe. And so there's a vast war between mechanical life forms and organic life forms that takes up 4 of his novels. But perhaps his best known novel that won all the awards in science fiction is one called Timescape, in which scientists use tachyons, particles that are right now just theoretical, that move faster than the speed of light, for communication back in time. And scientists on a ravaged Earth of the future use tachyons to communicate with our time to try to get us to reverse the terrible things we're doing to the Earth. And in this novel, actual astronomers appear as either real characters or as thinly disguised characters. So Carl Sagan is a character, Jeff and Margaret Burbidge are characters in this novel called Timescape. I recommend it if you're just getting into this kind of science fiction. And everything that Gregory Benford writes is, I think, really wonderful. And unlike many scientists who are still learning the craft of writing, he is a marvelous writer, so great characterization, reading that you can recommend to even your literary friends. This is Alastair Reynolds, less well known perhaps, but getting better and better known. He's a PhD astrophysicist who worked for the European Space Agency. Alastair Reynolds began publishing in science fiction and did so well that he was able to retire from astrophysics and devote himself full-time to writing. If you're starting with Alastair Reynolds, I particularly want to recommend the novel Revelation Space, which is his first big novel, or what turns out to be now many, many novels set in the same universe, full of astronomical wonder, black holes and other stellar remnants, really good considerations of how we might actually travel through space in the future without violating rules of science. Revelation Space is a rich and wonderful novel, but if you can find a short story, Beyond the Aquila Rift, to my mind, this is one of the best science fiction stories, short stories ever written. No one has quite conveyed the vastness of astronomical distances, which is, of course, a theme in all our planetarium work. No one has conveyed that as well as Alastair Reynolds in this short story, Beyond the Aquila Rift. And I won't give away anything about the surprising plot, but it's a wonderful story if you can find it. NASA scientist Jeff Landis has written science fiction short stories and one novel called Mars Crossing, in which someone is forced to take a walking trek across the rather difficult landscape of Mars. And again, it has accurate science about what it would be like to be stranded on Mars. Mars Crossing by Jeff Landis. The late Yoji Kondo was a NASA scientist who specialized in solar physics, and he wrote science fiction under a pen name. He didn't want NASA to know that he was writing science fiction. So his pen name was Eric Kotani. Sometimes he wrote by himself, sometimes he wrote with others. Here he's writing with Roger McBride Allen, an experienced science fiction writer. And this is perhaps his most dramatic book, Supernova. This is the only science fiction story I know that has an HR diagram in it. I don't know what the readers made of that HR diagram, but there it is, just in case you want a novel with that in it. And in this case, a nearby star goes supernova, and the Earth has to deal with the consequences. Of course, I think most of you know that Carl Sagan, with help from his wife, wrote a novel called Contact about his favorite subject, which is making contact with an extraterrestrial civilization, which was made into a movie with Jodie Foster, who actually came to the SETI Institute to study a little bit with Jill Tarter on how to play a serious woman scientist who's doing radio astronomy to find SETI signals. But other scientists that you may have heard of also write science fiction. This is Bill Hartman, one of the originators of our modern theory of how the moon formed, the giant impact theory of lunar formation. He's not only a science fiction writer, but also a skilled artist whose work is for sale, and I think a number of us have used in various lectures and shows. He also has written short stories, but has another novel about Mars called Mars Underground. And again, because he's a planetary scientist, this is a very good depiction of what it would be like on the red planet in the future. J. Craig Wheeler, John Wheeler's son, who's an astronomer at the University of Texas, wrote a novel called The Crone Experiment about mini black holes. And this was actually made into a movie, and there's a sequel to it. But if you want black hole fiction, this is certainly one example of that. He was president of the American Astronomical Society. So I guess that makes him the highest placed astronomer to write science fiction. Mike Brotherton at the University of Wyoming is also a professional science fiction writer with several books and short stories to his credit. He's also edited a number of anthologies of science fiction, which has good science in it. One of them is on the web, free of charge, if you just Google his name. I'll come to the other in a minute. But I did want to mention Kip Thorne, who I think many of you know, wrote and produced part of this movie called Interstellar, which is one of the most dramatic movies which uses good science. In Interstellar, the black hole that it plays an enormous part in the plot was actually programmed using the equations of general relativity generated by Thorne and his students. The story goes that they had really good depictions of what the environment near a black hole would look like, but they didn't have the money to actually do visualizations of it with their meager budget at Caltech. But the producers of the movie could afford the biggest supercomputer in the world, so they were able to do even more sophisticated visualizations than the group had been able to do, and that's what you see in the movie Interstellar. And the next year, Kip Thorne won the Nobel Prize for this movie. No, of course not for the movie, but for gravitational waves. But he is now the science fiction person who has the Nobel Prize. And as I was saying, Mike Brotherton has edited a recent anthology called Science Fiction by Scientists, where a number of people who are scientists have a short story. And I'm happy to say I'm one of those scientists. I have a supernova short story in this collection. So if you're looking for other scientist-inspired science fiction, that's a book that's available from Springer. Well, as I mentioned, I have a list of these stories as well. You can find my catalog of science fiction with good astronomy at the web address bit.ly/astrosci-fi, bit.ly astrosci-fi. So again, there's a catalog there with brief descriptions of each story. What's nice now is that a number of authors have put their scientifically correct science fiction stories on the web free. And so you could, whenever there's a free version of a good story available in this catalog, I put a link, a live link to that story. So you can go directly to the story or send people to the story. So if you're a science fiction fan, I encourage you to go look at that catalog. If you're not, I apologize for taking up your time, but it does seem like our own world is becoming more and more like science fiction. So I hope this hasn't been a waste of time for most of you. Now, all this interdisciplinary interest is not shared by everyone. Here's Lucy's comment in the Peanuts series. but I have to say that I found when I was teaching that this was a really good way to get students involved. There are many other aspects of astronomy that are commemorated in the humanities. There are astronomical poems. As I mentioned, there are astronomical plays, and certainly many films do a good job of portraying astronomy. Some people collect astronomical coins. There are certainly discussions of psychology and how it affects astronomy. There are astronomical legal issues that people have worked on, including who owns the moon and what rights astronauts have and how we would treat aliens if they came here. It's bad enough that our president has trouble with aliens when they're from another country. What would he do if they came from another world? And these are actually legal issues people are working on. So if you're interested in interdisciplinary approaches, there's certainly many other directions that you can go on. I want to tell you that I welcome suggestions for other things I haven't discussed, or even other things in the categories I did discuss. I'll leave this with my name, with my website, where many of the catalogs can be located at the bottom, and my email address if you want to get in touch with me. And thank you for having me as a change of pace at the convention. And I'll stop there and glad to have some discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And we have 10 minutes for questions.
And a break after that.
And a break after that.
Right. And did anybody put astronomical music into the chat window? Let's take a look. Lots of discussion of music here. Okay. Oh, Bowie, Mercury, Under Pressure. Okay, that's one I don't know. Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden. Yes, although when you really look at the words, they're not that much. Well, you'd let it pass. Good Supermassive Black Hole by Muse. Again, not much about science in it. Somebody liked Rush. Okay. Somebody mentioned that Why Does the Sun Shine was on Singing Science Records. Somebody wants it still to be incandescent gas and not plasma. Let's see. Wow, instrumentals by rock guitarists. That's someone I haven't heard of. Okay. All right. Huh. Okay, I'm writing some of these down. But you still haven't come up with the other ones that I know, but I'll give you a little more chance. And certainly if there are questions or comments, I'm happy to take them.
Andrew.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you have any good recommendations for rock and roll on Mars, because I was once asked to find something, and Pavlonis Mons by the Flaming Lips wasn't good enough, and the only thing I found was Alvin and the Chipmunks, There's No Rock and Roll on Mars, and that was not good enough for the professor I was trying to find his music for. So do you know any good rock and roll on Mars?
Well, let me look at the list. Not so much rock and roll, I must say. The one thing that I've recommended, which is not really rock and roll, is there's a Marscape rock and jazz fusion album by Jack Lancaster and Robin Lumley. Steve Lyon has a song called Deimos and Phobos on the album The Doctor, There's No Place Like Mars. But those are the only two that I know. Anybody have a Mars song? Lots of classical music, but not rock and roll.
Thank you. I'm writing these down.
All right. Any other thoughts or comments?
I did want to ask really quickly if you could mention that Maori song about the Pleiades again.
Oh, yes. So that's under constellations. Let me get to the right place. By the way, on the list, there are lots of things about Orion. There have been many, many pieces about Orion.
Something is like the glittering ghosts of heaven, was it?
Yes, and why am I not? A glittering host of heaven, but I'm not finding it here. Let's see. Bear with me 1 second. I'm going to go to the other list.
There is a local band here in Columbia, South Carolina, led by I believe he's a history teacher at a high school, but he's always loved space and astronomy. And he has written all kinds of songs about constellations, meteor showers, whatever. They performed live in the planetarium the night before the eclipse a couple of times. Visuals. And he did write one song in honor of the eclipse, which honestly I didn't think was as good as some of his other stuff. But anyway, believe it or not, their name is the Lowland Few. I have no explanation of that. But anyway, they have albums and music that's